Good day. Before I commence this video, can I quickly remind anybody who is watching any of our videos, that's to say the Duran videos, Alex Christoforou videos, or Alexander Mercouris videos on Rumble, that if you watch our videos on Rumble and go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button there. If you press that video, it will take you directly to our locals homepage where you can, if you choose, join our locals community. And if you choose to become an active locals member, you can publish your own exclusive content on our locals page, and you can also participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Right, now this video, like all of the others which I've been doing over the last few weeks, is focused on the crisis in Ukraine. Now, I say that I am somewhat unhappy about the perhaps undue focus on Ukraine at the moment. For example, there's been a major deal done between China and the Solomon Islands, which has caused some alarm in Australia and concern across the Pacific region. And I'm getting questions about this, and I would like to spend time covering and discussing it, but there is unfortunately no time, given the extent to which it is events in Ukraine and the crisis, the global crisis it has provoked, which is dominating the headlines. I've also received information that one of the reasons why India has taken such a skeptical view of the Western campaign against Russia is because of deep anger in India over the AUKUS deal between the United States, Britain and Australia, whereby Australia was able to obtain American and British nuclear technology to build nuclear submarines. Apparently this has gone down extremely badly in New Delhi, which was not consulted about the deal, and is caused serious damage in relations between India, Britain and the United States. Again, I can't confirm that. I've just read stories to this effect, which looked interesting. Normally, I would be spending time trying to investigate this story, find out whether it was true, provide more discussion about it. But with Ukraine and the global crisis dominating the headlines, I have no choice at the moment but to continue to focus primarily on the situation in that crisis and in the crisis relating to Ukraine itself. Now, turning to that crisis, when I woke up this morning, I found across the British media, and also, by the way, to some extent across the US media as well, though interestingly to a lesser extent, all sorts of claims that evidence of atrocities by Russian soldiers have been uncovered in Ukrainian towns, from which the Russian military has retreated in and around Kiev, following that announcement that the Russians made last week following the talks between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations in Istanbul. Now, I want to say a few things about this. Briefly, if these allegations are true, if civilians were indeed rounded up and executed without cause by Russian soldiers, then that is, of course, murder. It is also a major war crime, and the people who perpetrated this atrocity should be punished. However, I have to add this caveat. At the moment, and despite some of the media coverage that one is seeing in Britain and to some extent in the United States, which takes these allegations as proved, the allegations are in fact just that at the moment, essentially allegations. There hasn't been a proper independent investigation. All the information about this story comes essentially ultimately from the Ukrainian authorities themselves, who are of course in control of the situation on the ground. And as I have had many occasions to repeat when covering similar claims about events, for example, in Syria and Iraq during the wars there. During a period of armed conflict, it is extremely unwise, to put it mildly, to give any immediate or complete credence to any claims of this nature made by either of the conflicting parties. And I use that word either of the conflicting parties. I stress that word either, because I have also been receiving over the last couple of weeks all sorts of claims about similar or even worse atrocities allegedly committed by Ukrainian soldiers against Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. The Russian media has been full of these claims, even though they have not been reported in the West. The only claim of that nature that got brief mentions in the West were reports of some of the videos showing mistreatment by Ukrainians of Russian prisoners of war. Well, again, I want to say that I've never discussed those stories in any detail because, again, I assume that they are unreliable until they are proved to be true because, again, they originate from one side in a conflict, that side in this case being Russia. Very occasionally, some incidents do take place in wars where you can give attributions with some confidence. There was a missile strike, for example, on the city of Donetsk, which hit a civilian area, which, by the way, received astonishingly little attention in the Western media, and which was reported by the Italian newspaper La Stampa as a missile strike on a Ukrainian-held city. That incident, I can reliably say, most certainly did occur. But generally, and I'm going to stick to this rule, I don't comment on these stories in any detail until and unless I get what I consider to be sufficient corroboration from independent investigators, which leads me to think that what happened, what is alleged to happen, actually did happen. Before I finish on this, I would say that a couple of weeks ago, there was a huge amount of coverage in the Western media, again, especially in Britain, of a particular incident in Mariupol. A photograph was published in many newspapers in the West showing a particular individual who was standing near the building, which was the supposed focus of this particular incident. The media reported the story that the Ukrainians wanted us all to follow. What they're not reporting, or at least not to anything like the same extent, is that the individual who has appeared in that photograph has now come forward and is giving an account which is very different from, or at least different in many important respects, from that initial coverage of the story. Now, I want to stress again, that's what that person is saying now. It doesn't prove, by the way, that the initial coverage was necessarily wrong. It's just another example of why one should be very careful before accepting as fact things which at the moment are only alleged. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of this. As I said, if there's ever an independent investigation, which, by the way, I seriously doubt, who is going to carry out such an independent investigation of allegations like this? No one that I can see. But until there is an independent investigation, or unless the evidence becomes overwhelming, I'm going to hold fire on further discussions of this issue. Now, turning to what is going on the ground in Ukraine, I'm going to say straight away that over the weekends we tend to get much less information about the military activities, which is perhaps unsurprising because the people, the open sources that I rely upon for information about what is going on the battlefronts obviously tend to enjoy their weekends. Nonetheless, it is indisputably the case that there's been extensive Russian missile attacks across Ukraine. There was apparently a major attack on an oil refinery near Odessa, and the Russian military, for their part, have provided further information about Ukrainian tanks, armor, infantry fighting vehicles, surface-to-air missile batteries, radar stations, command posts, and the rest, which have all apparently or supposedly been destroyed. Now, I tend to place credence on these Russian claims of the destruction of the greater part, much the greater part, by the way, of Ukraine's armored forces, for one very simple reason, which is, as I discussed in my video yesterday, Ukraine is now asking the Western powers for replacements for the infantry fighting vehicles and tanks which it has lost. And Germany is providing some old East German infantry fighting vehicles from the middle period of the Cold War. And there's talk, there's rumours that the United States is trying to rustle up some tanks from old warehouses dotted around Eastern Europe, where some of these Cold War era Soviet tanks can also still be found. That, to my mind, tends to support these Russian claims that the Ukrainians are indeed running out fast of armored weapons, of armored vehicles and artillery and such things, and that this is severely affecting their abilities to conduct offensive or counter-offensive operations in places like Kherson, where they've apparently they did attempt an offensive last week, which was apparently beaten back with heavy losses, and in Donbass, where the major battle is now shaping up. So there is that information. There's also a story which I emphasize is just a story, I can't corroborate it, that the Ukrainian troops still holding out in Mariupol at the Azovstal steelworks are now holding as virtual prisoners some of their NATO advisors, who were the people who were supposed to be evacuated rather, in those failed helicopter flights that we were hearing about a few days ago. I want to stress this is a completely uncorroborated story, but those who report it claim that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has been particularly trying to get Putin's help to extricate these people from the Azovstal steelworks, a fact which might suggest, by the way, that these people are French, in order to try presumably to save their lives. How Putin would do that, I have absolutely no idea. And I want to stress again that this is an uncorroborated and unverified story. The other thing that I'm now hearing is that there's a report circulating that in the run-up to the war, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, asked President Zelensky of Ukraine to publicly drop Ukraine's demand to enter NATO, and that this was done as a last-ditch attempt by Scholz to try to avoid the war. Now, this sounds like a plausible story because it has been reported in the Wall Street Journal, which is presumably the kind of media outlet which would be able to corroborate this as true. Zelensky supposedly refused, thus bringing about the war. Now, I would say that if this story is true, and I believe it, then of course Ukraine has now essentially agreed to what Scholz was telling Zelensky to agree to before the war. Scholz told Zelensky to drop Ukraine's request for NATO membership. Apparently, Scholz said that if Ukraine did that, Ukraine would then be able to find security guarantees as part of a renegotiation of Europe's security architecture involving Russia. And the bitter irony, huge cause of regret in this is that what Zelensky supposedly rejected in that week before the war is what Ukraine has accepted now, or at least accepted in Istanbul. Now, I've said that the security guarantees that Ukraine is demanding are wildly excessive, and it seems that Western governments are increasingly making clear that they're not prepared to grant Ukraine the kind of security guarantees which it is seeking. They might be prepared to look at arrangements for to secure peace in Ukraine, but they're not prepared to enter into commitments that would in effect oblige them to defend Ukraine if Ukraine were ever to be attacked by Russia. So already it looks as if those conditions that the Ukrainians were seeking are being shot down by the Western powers. And the rumours are that they're not too keen on Ukraine entering NATO, entering the EU either. I never placed very much credence on those conditions that the Ukrainians were giving. But the key point about dropping the demand for NATO membership, that has been publicly made now by Ukraine. Given that this is so, how sad is it that Ukraine didn't do that 7 weeks ago when the proposition was put to Zelensky by Scholz? A war might then have been avoided. We would have avoided the disaster that we are seeing. Many young men, and not just young men, who are now dead, would still be alive. Now, I should say that there have been some comments about the fact that I have been repeatedly saying that the Ukraine needs to negotiate a peace deal to bring this war to an end. I think this episode provides an illustration of why I am saying this. There is no sense, no logic, no humanity in refusing to agree to something when the only effect of doing that is to bring disaster upon yourself and upon your own people, when you have to concede it anyway, eventually. And I understand that the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are still ongoing. There have been more detailed conversations in a virtual format going on between the Ukrainian and Russian officials. And I do hope that the Ukrainians do start to move further on some of the other issues, some of the sticking points like the status of Crimea and Donbass, which is still complicating the progress of the negotiations. I think my own feeling is that a peace agreement is within reach, but it does require Ukraine to make more concessions, which might be difficult and which could have been avoided if Zelensky had agreed to this proposal by Scholz 7 weeks ago, but which, after all this fighting, it's impossible now realistically to see how Ukraine can avoid. The alternative is a gigantic battle in Donbass, where the forces that have been gathered are such that I think no one realistically expects Ukraine to win. The commander of the German army, interestingly, essentially said as much in an interview with Bild. He criticized some aspects of the Russian operation, but he even spoke about the possibility of Ukraine being partitioned at the end of this conflict. So better, it seems to me, for Ukraine to make these concessions now and preserve what is left rather than go down fighting in what to me looks like an idiosyncratic and pointless cause. That's all I'm going to say about all of that. Now, one point I would now make, which is increasingly about the economic situation. What we have seen over the last few weeks is a stabilization of the economic position in Russia following strong action by the Russian authorities and the Russian central bank. I think that there is still a real possibility of further volatility. I don't think Russia is out of the woods, but it is steadily moving in that direction. And the increasing indications are that the collapse of the Russian economy that some people expected is not going to take place, and nor will it lead to regime change in Moscow. There are reports, I read them on the Naked Capitalism website, which is usually quite well informed about such things, that there is growing frustration and anger about this in Washington, and certainly there's also been angry words about it from the Polish government, that the US and Poland are increasingly frustrated by the failure of the sanctions policy to achieve the objectives that they expected, and apparently they've been fanning diplomats and other people across European capitals and across world capitals to try to persuade various governments to crank up sanctions pressure on Russia even more, in the hope that this might cause Russia to crack. What I'm hearing is that doors are being slammed in the faces of these diplomats, and I'll come to the reason why in a moment. But what I would say, that to the extent that this is true, if it is indeed the case that there is more pressure from the US and countries like Poland to increase the sanctions pressure on Russia, that does increasingly look to me like a case of doubling down, or if you prefer, doing the same thing again and again and again and again and expecting a different result. The latter has been defined by some people as a sign of insanity. It seems to me that this idea needs to be dropped, and anybody who's trying to use, as the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, appears to be, it seems to be trying to use these latest claims about war crimes in cities in the suburbs of Kiev that have been appearing over the last few days as further cause to tighten up sanctions, really needs to think very carefully about what is happening. Because all across the world, there is now the gathering indications of a massive economic crisis. Russia may, for the moment, have stabilized its economy, but it's increasingly clear that the rest of the world, and the western part of it certainly, has not. We are hearing about a massive cost of living crisis, as it is called in Britain. The German government has also admitted that it cannot act to offset the full effect of the pressure on living standards in Germany. There's warnings from the US Federal Reserve Board that it may have to increase interest rates further in May. And of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, German industry is now giving increasingly urgent warnings that if there is a further escalation of the sanctions pressure leading to a cut-off in natural gas supplies to Europe from Russia, then there will be a grave economic crisis in Germany, one which large parts of German industry might struggle to survive. Moreover, this is having political consequences. In France, the once insurmountable, impregnable lead that Emmanuel Macron appeared to have in the opinion polls as the presidential elections loomed is now dwindling. I still expect him to win, by the way, against his rival Marine Le Pen, but it's striking how there seems to have been a major loss of momentum over the last few weeks, And undoubtedly, the pressure on living standards in France is having an effect. There are reports that protests are now starting to spread across Britain. Some of them may be organised. And in the United States, President Biden's popularity continues to fall. I would add that before very long, I expect also a major crisis, political crisis, in two other European countries. Italy, where Mario Draghi's government has always looked something of a confected affair, and where I suspect before very long a decision may be taken to break his government and to move for fresh elections, which, by the way, the right-wing parties would most probably win. But perhaps more importantly, there could very well soon be a political crisis in Germany as well, where the new government of Olaf Scholz, is now, it seems to me, skating on extremely thin ice. Now, that brings me back to the topic of Olaf Scholz, because, of course, if it is true, as the Wall Street Journal says, and as I believe, that Scholz told Zelensky to drop his demand for Ukraine's demand for membership of NATO, then when Zelensky refused, it was incumbent upon Scholz, in order to avoid this crisis, to come out publicly alongside Macron and to say openly and frankly that Ukraine would not be joining NATO, that the invitation to Ukraine to join NATO, which was made in the 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO summit, was a massive mistake, and that in light of this, the question of Ukraine's NATO membership had been taken off the agenda. And it was also incumbent upon Scholz, as Germany's Chancellor, to then join with Macron to support the proposal which both Macron and Scholz were making in private, but which were unwilling to flesh out, and which were unwilling also to make in public, for a negotiated restructuring of Europe's security architecture as requested by the Russians. Now, Macron deserves much blame for allowing the situation to spiral out of control to the extent that it did. His unwillingness to break with the Germans neutered his diplomatic initiatives in the run-up to the war, but the greatest blame and the biggest fault lies with Olaf Scholz, because if he was prepared to say these things to Zelensky in private, when Zelensky refused to listen, then it was incumbent upon Scholz, in order to preserve peace in Europe and to ensure the preservation of Germany's and Europe's economic position, it was incumbent upon Scholz to come out in public and to say what the true position was. And that might have put pressure on his government. It might have made the Greens in Germany unhappy. But in a matter of war or peace, again, that is the obligation, that is the duty of a leader, to come forward and to do what is right in order to preserve peace. If any one individual, therefore, must take the greatest responsibility for this war, in my opinion, it is Olaf Scholz, whatever devilry was being committed by others in Washington and London and potentially in Brussels too. So there we are. We are looking at a gathering economic crisis. We're looking at a gathering political crisis in Europe, one which all the indications are could have been avoided. And one would like to believe and would earnestly hope that all of these European leaders would finally make a break from the Brussels establishment and from the hardliners in Washington and London, and would be urging the Ukrainians towards peace. Now, The reports last week from the London Times suggested that perhaps to some extent that was precisely what the Germans and the French are doing, and that this is causing concern in London. I sincerely hope so. I think that the Germans and the French, in their own interests, if they are taking these steps, should ignore, finally, what their erstwhile friends in Washington and London and even Brussels are telling them, and they should instead press for peace. Whether, of course, they will is another matter. What I will say is this: if they don't, and if this war goes on, and if there is a disaster in Ukraine, a military disaster in Ukraine, and if there is an attendant economic disaster in Europe, future generations will not look kindly upon them. And that is perhaps the point at which I'm going to finish this program. Thank you for joining me again today. I'll try and keep you informed of events to the best of my ability. I'm sure there'll be more information from the battlefronts and from the negotiations before long. And that's enough from me today. Thank you for joining me again. Remember, you can join us on Rumble and Locals and on other platforms. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. And of course, if you've liked this video, remember to tick the like button to check your subscription to this channel. And thank you again for joining me today, and more from me soon.